In the grand halls of European palaces, a horrifying truth was hidden from the world for generations: the systematic erasure of royal children born with disabilities. These children, too often discarded behind monastery walls or locked away in institutions, were seen as a threat to the very foundation of monarchy, the myth of divine perfection. This was not some distant, medieval story, but a dark conspiracy that persisted into the 20th century, shrouded in secrecy and deceit. Behind the facade of royal grandeur, families relied on an elaborate network to hide their disabled children, altering birth and death records to erase them from history altogether. This story is no fairy tale, no work of fiction. It's a cold, unvarnished truth documented in royal records and whispered through the corridors of power. Today, we unravel the tragic tale of Nerissa and Catherine Bose-Lyon, cousins to Queen Elizabeth II, who lived their entire lives erased from public memory, hidden away in an asylum, their existence a carefully guarded secret. What you are about to hear is a story of disgrace, where the machinery of power prioritized reputation over human dignity, where royal blood was considered too precious to be stained by imperfection. Behind the golden gates and silk curtains of Europe's grandest palaces, there existed a truth so carefully buried that generations of royal children could vanish without leaving a single trace in official history. What makes this story particularly haunting is that we're not talking about medieval superstition or the dark ages of ignorance. We're talking about a calculated, systematic conspiracy that stretched well into the 20th century. It involved some of the world's most powerful families, working together to erase their own flesh and blood from existence. For over 1,000 years, European monarchies built their legitimacy on one simple claim: divine favor and genetic superiority. They presented themselves as chosen by God to rule over ordinary mortals. This carefully constructed mythology required absolute perfection in every public appearance, every official portrait, and every family tree that traced bloodlines back through centuries of supposedly flawless breeding. When nature defied this illusion by delivering a child with Down syndrome or other visible disabilities, the machinery of royal concealment would spring into action with terrifying efficiency. These children represented more than personal tragedy or family embarrassment. They threatened the very foundation upon which monarchies justified their power and privilege. The scale and sophistication of this concealment is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. Royal families didn't just hide problematic children in back rooms or avoid mentioning them in polite conversation. They rewrote reality itself. They did this through an elaborate network of complicit physicians, genealogists, church officials, and institutional administrators who understood that their careers and livelihoods depended on maintaining royal secrets. Birth certificates could be altered or destroyed within hours of a child's arrival. Death certificates could be issued for infants who were very much alive, and would remain so for decades. The official genealogical records that noble families treated as sacred historical documents could be falsified with the stroke of a pen whenever an inconvenient child needed to disappear from the family tree forever. Consider Burke's Peerage, the authoritative guide to British aristocracy. This was the book that families consulted like scripture and historians relied upon for accurate information. Yet Burkes would dutifully record that certain royal children had died in infancy when those same children were actually being shipped off to remote institutions under assumed names. The editors of these supposedly objective historical records understood perfectly well that they were publishing lies. But they did so anyway because maintaining the fiction of royal perfection was more important than documenting the actual truth. What's particularly chilling about this system is how it transcended national boundaries and political differences. It created an international conspiracy of silence that linked royal houses across the entire European continent. From the frost-covered palaces of Prussia to the sun-drenched courts of Spain, from the ancient castles of England to the republican pretensions of France, the pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. This wasn't random acts of individual families. This was a deeply embedded aristocratic culture that valued appearances above humanity. It understood that disabled children threatened marriage alliances, succession plans, and the aura of divine blessing that monarchies depended upon for their survival. Marriage alliances between royal houses meant that information about concealment methods and reliable institutions could be shared discreetly between families. A German princess who married into the British royal family would bring with her knowledge of how her own family had made certain children disappear. This created networks of expertise in erasure that operated as efficiently as any modern intelligence service. The mechanics of concealment evolved over centuries as technology and social structures changed. But the underlying logic remained constant throughout. The birth of a disabled child challenged everything that royalty claimed about itself. In medieval times, when most people couldn't read and official records were scarce, families relied on the Catholic Church's vast network of monasteries and convents to absorb inconvenient children, hiding them behind walls of religious silence. These institutions demanded strict vows from everyone inside and operated with minimal oversight from secular authorities. They provided perfect cover for complete disappearance. A generous donation to the monastery, a quiet conversation with the abbot, and a royal infant could vanish as completely as if they had never been born. These children would spend their entire lives behind cloistered walls, never understanding who they were or why they had been taken away from those who should have loved them. As courts grew more sophisticated during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, the methods of concealment became more elaborate. Palace physicians learned to issue carefully worded announcements about infant deaths from unnamed illnesses. Court painters were instructed to omit certain children from official portraits. Chroniclers knew exactly which names should never appear in the historical records they were compiling for posterity. The system adapted and evolved, but its purpose remained the same. Then came the 19th century, a period of profound change that paradoxically made concealment both more necessary and more technically feasible than ever before. With the rise of newspapers, photography, and a more literate public, royal families suddenly faced unprecedented scrutiny of their private lives. At the same time, they gained access to new institutional structures that made it easier than ever to make inconvenient children disappear, far more efficiently than the medieval monasteries ever could. It was also in this era that John Langdon Down formally identified Down syndrome in 1866, giving physicians a scientific framework to understand what previous generations had believed to be caused by demonic influence or divine punishment. But this medical progress didn't do anything to reduce the stigma attached to disability. In fact, it may have only intensified the fear. The new scientific understanding suggested that such conditions were hereditary defects that could contaminate bloodlines and be passed down through generations. For royal families obsessed with genetic purity, this was their worst nightmare turned into reality. The Victorian obsession with classification, proper social order, and the emerging pseudoscience of eugenics created an intellectual climate where locking away disabled people seemed not just acceptable, but even enlightened. It was framed as protecting both the individuals themselves and society from the supposed dangers of genetic contamination. This was the era when purpose-built institutions began spreading across Europe and America. They were marketed to wealthy families as offering scientific treatment and medical care. But their real purpose was to warehouse human beings whom society preferred to ignore. The Royal Oldswood Hospital in Surrey is a prime example of how these facilities operated. It opened in 1855 under the Victorian label Asylum for Idiots. The very name reveals the disdain hidden behind what were supposed to be charitable intentions. Oldswood specialized in accepting patients from wealthy backgrounds, people who could afford to pay substantial fees for long-term care and complete discretion. The hospital's design reflected its true purpose. High walls surrounded the grounds. Locked wards filled the main buildings. Its remote location, far from London, made unauthorized visits virtually impossible, ensuring that the residents remained invisible to the outside world. The hospital would eventually play a central role in one of the 20th century's most shocking royal scandals. But even before that, it quietly absorbed disabled children from aristocratic families across England, creating a shadow population of forgotten nobles who lived and died within its walls, with no one outside ever knowing they had existed. The rise of eugenics provided royal families with something more valuable than just institutions. It gave them a modern, scientific-sounding vocabulary that made their cruel choices appear as responsible statecraft, instead of heartless abandonment of their own children. Now, so-called objective medical authorities argued that people with disabilities represented a threat to racial purity and national strength that needed to be addressed through systematic segregation. Royal families, long obsessed with bloodline purity for dynastic reasons, found in eugenics an ideology that transformed their private shame into public duty. They could now claim that hiding disabled children wasn't about protecting family reputation, it was about safeguarding the genetic health of entire nations. This brings us to the heartbreaking story of Princess Alexandrin of Prussia, a tale that reveals how the system operated even within families that genuinely loved their disabled children. Alexandrin was born in 1915 to Prince August Wilhelm, son of Kaiser Wilhelm II. From birth, she showed clear signs of Down syndrome. In the rigid hierarchies of Prussian aristocracy, where the imperial family saw itself as the pinnacle of German civilization and genetic excellence, her existence represented an unacceptable flaw. It threatened the dynasty's carefully maintained image of superiority. Her parents made an almost unprecedented decision for the time. They chose to keep her at home rather than immediately sending her away to an institution. But this decision required constant vigilance to keep her existence hidden from anyone outside the immediate household. Servants were forced to sign legal agreements, promising never to speak of what they saw. Visitors were carefully managed, ensuring that Alexandrin was never glimpsed by anyone who might spread rumors. Official family photographs were taken without her, ensuring that no visual record would survive to contradict the fiction that the family was perfect. As Alexandrin grew older, the challenges of keeping her hidden became insurmountable. An infant could be explained away as sickly or kept out of sight in nursery quarters. But a child, and then a teenager, with visible disabilities could not easily be concealed in a palace where hundreds of staff members passed through the corridors. Her siblings attended schools, appeared at ceremonial functions, and gradually took on public roles, preparing them for adult positions within the aristocracy. Alexandrin, however, remained confined to private apartments, which became less of a home and more of a gilded cage. The loneliness she endured is almost impossible to imagine. She was surrounded by family who, on some level, loved her but could never allow her to truly be a part of their lives in any public or meaningful way. Then came 1918, and the fall of the German monarchy. You might think this would have freed her from the rigid constraints of imperial protocol. Instead, the political upheaval only deepened the family's commitment to secrecy. They now faced the added threat of revolutionary enemies who might use any perceived weakness against them, weaponizing their daughter's existence as propaganda against the discredited aristocracy. In the chaos of Weimar Germany and later Nazi rule, when former aristocrats faced everything from social ostracism to actual persecution, the family's fear that Alexandrin's existence could be used against them kept her hidden as ever. Her world shrank to just a few rooms and a handful of trusted caregivers. She lived this way for 65 years. When she died in 1980, disability rights movements were growing stronger across Europe, and attitudes toward disability were supposedly changing. Yet her death went unannounced. Her funeral was private, attended by almost no one. Even today, most histories of the Prussian royal family make no mention of her. The concealment that defined her life extended beyond death into a kind of permanent historical erasure. Her tragedy wasn't her disability. It was the system that demanded she remain invisible. While her parents may have loved her within the confines of those private apartments, they never found the courage to challenge the expectations that kept her hidden away. This shows how even genuine affection could be corrupted by the weight of aristocratic pride and the fear of what the world might think. But if Alexandrin's story shows how even loving families could be pressured into hiding disabled children, the case of Nerissa and Catherine Bose-Lyon takes us to the extreme of institutional abandonment. Their story is particularly shocking because it involves the British royal family at the height of its 20th century power, and it takes place not in some distant medieval era, but within living memory of people still alive today. Nerissa was born in 1919, and Catherine followed in 1926. They were the daughters of John Bose-Lyon, whose sister Elizabeth would marry King George VI and become Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. This made these girls first cousins to Queen Elizabeth II and part of one of the most famous and photographed families in the world. Both girls were born with severe developmental disabilities that almost certainly included Down syndrome. The exact diagnoses remain sealed in medical files that the family has never released to public scrutiny. From their earliest years, It was clear that they would never be able to participate in normal royal life or fulfill the social functions expected of aristocratic young women. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 and Catherine was 15, their family made a decision that would condemn both girls to lives of complete obscurity and institutional confinement. The calculated cruelty of this choice becomes all too clear when you understand the elaborate deception that accompanied it. The sisters were sent to the Royal Oldswood Hospital for mental deficiency in Surrey. This was the same Victorian institution that had been quietly warehousing disabled aristocrats for decades. They were checked in under false names to ensure that no one could trace their royal connections. But this alone wasn't enough to satisfy the family's need for absolute secrecy. While Nerissa and Catherine were being admitted to Oldswood and assigned to its overcrowded wards, something remarkable was happening with the official records. Burke's Peerage, the most authoritative guide to British aristocracy, was simultaneously recording that both girls had died in 1940, an entire year before they were actually institutionalized. This false death date would remain in the official record for over 40 years. No one questioned why the most trusted genealogical source in Britain was reporting deaths that had never actually occurred. The scale of complicity required to maintain this fiction was staggering. It involved layers of institutional cooperation that revealed just how deeply aristocratic privilege had rotted British society. Successfully erasing two living people from official history required doctors who falsified admission records. It required genealogists who knowingly published falsehoods. It required family members who agreed to never speak of the girl's existence. It required hospital administrators who ensured their true identities remained concealed, even from most staff members. And it required a broader culture of deference to aristocratic wishes, where no one dared ask uncomfortable questions or challenge what was happening. All of this unfolded while Elizabeth Bose-Lyon served as Queen Consort during World War II. She was celebrated across Britain and the Commonwealth for visiting bombed neighborhoods, boosting morale, and embodying the values of family devotion and maternal compassion that were supposed to define the royal family. The hypocrisy of this public image, which was so far removed from the private reality of two abandoned nieces locked away in an asylum, is staggering and almost incomprehensible. Inside Oldswood, Nerissa and Catherine lived among nearly 2,000 other residents, in conditions that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. Overcrowded dormitories offered virtually no privacy. Medical care was minimal, extending only to basic physical maintenance. There was almost no intellectual stimulation, education, or meaningful activity to occupy their time. The hospital operated on Victorian principles, viewing disability as a permanent and hopeless condition that required nothing more than custodial warehousing. While wealthier families could sometimes arrange slightly better conditions for their relatives through additional payments, the fundamental experience was one of being stored, rather than cared for. Their humanity was reduced to the most basic functions: eating, sleeping, and existing without purpose or dignity. The sisters were completely cut off from their family history and royal connections. They were treated as anonymous patients, their true identities carefully concealed even from the nurses and attendants who provided their daily care. They spent decade after decade in the same institution. Meanwhile, outside its walls, their cousin Elizabeth became queen in 1952, and the British royal family reached unprecedented heights of global fame and influence. While Queen Elizabeth II was photographed with her children and grandchildren, praised worldwide for her dedication to family and duty, while she attended state dinners and received foreign dignitaries, representing British values to the world, her first cousins lived forgotten in an asylum just 30 miles from Buckingham Palace. The cruel irony of this proximity makes the abandonment even more painful. It wasn't as though the family had lost track of Nerissa and Catherine or simply didn't know where they were. They knew exactly where the girls were. They were paying for their institutional care through carefully disguised financial arrangements. And they were actively maintaining the fiction that both girls had died in 1940. This required continuous effort and complicity with Burke's Peerage and other official sources. Yet, incredibly, no one in the family ever seriously questioned whether this arrangement was acceptable. No one asked if two human beings deserved better than to spend their entire lives locked away from the world simply because they had been born with disabilities that might have complicated the royal family's carefully managed public image. The contrast between the monarchy's public image of compassion and duty and the private reality of these abandoned cousins living in institutional squalor reveals a hypocrisy so profound that when the truth finally emerged, it shook public confidence in ways that decades of scandals about divorces and affairs never quite managed to do. The revelation came through investigative journalism in the 1980s. Reporters began noticing discrepancies in Burke's peerage and started asking questions. Why had the genealogical records listed deaths in 1940 for two women who, according to Olswood's files, were very much alive and had been residents at the institution for over 40 years? When the story broke, the royal family initially tried to downplay the scandal. They suggested that attitudes toward disability had been different in the 1940s and that institutionalization had been considered standard practice at the time. But this defense quickly collapsed when it became clear that many families with far fewer resources than the Bose-Lyons had managed to care for disabled children at home. The real reason for the abandonment wasn't a lack of options or medical knowledge, it was simple fear. Fear that the girl's existence might damage the family's reputation. Nerissa died in 1986 at the age of 66, still officially recorded in Burke's peerage as having died in 1940. Her funeral was small and secret, with almost no family attendance. Even in death, she needed to remain hidden from public view. Catherine lived on at Olswood and other care facilities until 2014. She died at 87 after spending an incomprehensible 73 consecutive years in institutional care. Catherine had outlived nearly everyone who had made the decision to send her away. She had outlived the Queen Mother, who had been her aunt. She had outlived the very social attitudes that had justified her abandonment. She had even outlived the institution where she spent most of her life. Yet, she never experienced anything resembling freedom, family, or any normal human connection. The Bose-Lyon scandal forced uncomfortable questions about how supposedly civilized and Christian families could abandon their own members so completely. But it's worth noting that responses to disabled royal children existed on a spectrum. Some families chose complete institutional abandonment. Others made different choices, which were more humane but still marked by secrecy and shame. Take de Gaulle, the daughter of French President Charles de Gaulle. Born with Down syndrome in 1928, unlike the Bose-Lyons, the de Gaulles kept in at home. They provided tutors, caregivers, and genuine affection. They integrated her into private family life and ensured she grew up surrounded by siblings who knew and loved her. But even this more humane approach required complete public concealment. Charles de Gaulle's political career, from resistance leader to president of France, meant that any admission of having a disabled daughter could be used as ammunition by political enemies. They might argue that a leader with imperfect children was unfit to govern, and de Gaulle's existence became a carefully guarded state secret. Staff at the Élysée Palace during her father's presidency were instructed never to mention her. Government protocol ensured that she would never appear in any official photographs or records. The contradiction of being beloved within the family but invisible to the public created its own kind of suffering, and became aware of her father's fame, understanding that she could never share in it. Something about her made it impossible for her to be openly acknowledged. Charles de Gaulle himself struggled with this contradiction. His private writings revealed deep affection and sorrow for Anne. Yet, he never publicly acknowledged her existence. He was bound by the same prejudices he fought against in politics. His love for his daughter was real, but constrained by a society that still equated disability with shame, even in the supposedly enlightened mid-20th century. And died in 1948 at just 20 years old, before her father became president. Her death was private, her funeral small, and the cause undisclosed, though it was likely linked to medical complications common with Down syndrome. The tragedy wasn't a lack of parental love, it was a world that forced even devoted parents to hide their children's existence. The comparison between these different responses reveals something crucial. From the Bose-Lyons' total abandonment to the de Gaulle's loving but hidden care, the spectrum of aristocratic and political choices all shared one common assumption: disability was fundamentally incompatible with public life. Children born with conditions like Down syndrome had to be concealed from view, whether sent away to institutions or kept hidden at home. What united all these families across different countries and decades was the belief that appearances mattered more than humanity. Maintaining the illusion of perfection was worth sacrificing the dignity and potential of actual human beings. Society wasn't ready, and perhaps would never be ready, to accept that powerful families could produce imperfect children who deserved the same love and acknowledgement as their supposedly normal siblings. The infrastructure that enabled this concealment was vast and international. It stretched across borders and involved cooperation between institutions, medical professionals, genealogists, and government officials who all understood their roles in maintaining aristocratic secrets. Facilities like Royal Oldswood specialized in discretion just as much as care. They were located in remote countryside, far from major cities, where unexpected visitors were unlikely. The daily operations of the institution could proceed without public scrutiny. These places operated more like fortresses than hospitals, with high walls, locked gates, and ward arrangements designed to maximize control, not comfort or therapeutic value. Inside these institutions, class distinctions persisted. Wealthier families could pay for better conditions, private rooms, more attentive staff, or small privileges that differentiated their relatives from the hundreds of other residents who received only the most basic custodial care. Yet, even the most privileged patients endured lives stripped of dignity, purpose, and hope. The fundamental philosophy of these places was that disability was permanent, hopeless, and best kept hidden from the world. The psychological toll of this system was immense, extending far beyond the hidden children themselves. It impacted entire families, who lived with guilt, secrecy, and the corrosive effects of maintaining lies across generations. Parents who agreed to institutionalize children often carried that grief for the rest of their lives. Siblings grew up confused and traumatized, discovering that brothers or sisters they thought had died were actually alive but hidden away. By the time attitudes began shifting in the mid-20th century and disability rights movements started challenging these practices, many of the hidden royal children had already died. Their names were erased, their graves unmarked, their stories lost to a history that had been deliberately falsified to serve the interests of families who valued their reputations more than the lives of their own children. Those who survived, like Bose-Lyon, outlived the system that had imprisoned them but never escaped its consequences. They spent their final years in a world that had supposedly moved beyond such cruelty, but still couldn't quite acknowledge or repair the damage that had been done.